This is the sixth and probably the last of the podcasts that I'm going to do on my time in Nha Trang, South Vietnam, where I served as the head of intelligence for psychological operations for Two Corps, and Two Corps at that time in the 1967 to 69 time period was about a third geographically of South Vietnam. We're going to talk about Tet. And Tet was Tet is the Chinese New Year, and it's a big event for those who celebrate Tet, and they do it with fireworks and make quite a commotion about it. And Tet in 1968 was at the end of January and early February, and it was the time when the North Vietnamese, or primarily the South Vietnamese army, or the Viet Cong, attacked broadly across South Vietnam in the urban areas, including getting onto the grounds of the American Embassy and other towns. And so this was a shocking event for Americans. It wasn't something that was anticipated, and it was a turning point in the war. After Tet, not long after Tet, President Lyndon Johnson decided that he would not run for reelection in 1968. And 1968 was a year that, in retrospect, was one of the most violent in American history because Martin Luther King was assassinated in May, Robert Kennedy, um, John Kennedy's brother, and father of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's in the cabinet right now, was assassinated on the night of the California primary. Robert Kennedy probably, almost assuredly, would have been nominated for president. He might well have won had he not been killed in June. So it was a violent year with an awful lot of demonstrations and anti-war stuff. In 1968, I had taken over as the head of intelligence of psychological operations, the 1st of December, and was a battalion at our new battalion. I was living in a villa in the Trang, a rather large home with 5 other officers, and that's where we were on the night of Tet. Now, I had received a couple of days before Tet a top secret document, which had been sent out by our guys in Saigon, our intelligence people, and and it read, I've always loved this. Here's the total text. Increased enemy activity may be expected shortly before, during, or following Tet. Well, they certainly got that right as they covered their behinds with that one, because we almost got broken up in Nha Trang so thoroughly that we might have had to make our way through the 5 or 6 blocks over to the beach and hope that somebody got us off the beach, or climb in the South China Sea and start swimming for our lives. My neighborhood was overrun. The American Air Force bombed us, did strafing runs over us. The sky was lit up with orange flares all night long during the period of Tet. Now, I don't remember a lot about this. The reality is that I wrote about it in my diary, and what I know, with a few exceptions, and I'll tell you now, is what I wrote down. This is very common when you are in traumatic events. This was pretty traumatic, because that night I was uh, in my bedroom in my villa, and about 10 o'clock or so, and the fireworks were going off, and that's to be expected. But gradually the fireworks died out, and the gunfire began. Now, if you've been in garrison or not out in the field, you might not recognize that this is gunfire, but I certainly did. And it wasn't long before the Air Force showed up and began strafing, doing one thing and another, and dropping flares and so on. And I was I was terrified. So I rolled off my bunk, off my bed, onto this tile floor, and I pulled the mattress over me. And now I'm laying here as this war is going on outside, and I'm just gradually, I'm just filled with the with sweat. And but after a period of time, I'm not quite sure how long, a serenity came over me, and I realized I am drumming my fingers. I'm just drumming on this tile floor, and I'm listening to this, and it's just all. And I would say to myself, uh, laying here under this mattress is not going to save your life. And in fact, nothing is going to save your life tonight because they're bombing your neighborhood and they're strafing it and uh, probably trying to keep the Viet Cong or the bad guys from coming down the street and kicking in doors and doing. Uh, if the Air Force doesn't kill us, maybe whoever's attacking us probably will. And at that point, I kicked off the mattress and I went outside, and there was kind of a large porch between sections of the house, and I climbed up on top of the roof and with my camera, and I sat up on the top of the roof and I watched um, all the mischief take place in the sky. And gradually, the other officers in the unit also came out, and we were just sat up on the roof because we weren't going to survive this thing. And so I have pictures of that night and of the strafing going on and of all the of all that mischief. And it's looking back on it, it's very surreal. Now, around 4 o'clock the following morning, 4 to 4 o'clock, four or five, before sunrise that day, the um, the fighting died out. And this is how it was when I was in the field. Uh, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army would own the country basically at night. But as the daylight came, we had helicopters and gunships, and we could chase them around. So the fighting stopped around shortly an hour or so before dawn, and everything would get quieted down, and everybody'd have a day of it. And then when night came, if they're still out there and they want to mix it up, they'd come after us again. And this is what happened. It got the fighting died down, the noise, the shooting died down, the flares flared out, and the Air Force went home. And now I'm a newspaper guy. I'm curious, and it is really true. Curiosity will kill the cat. And there was a short way that I could go down to where my offices were, which was down on a Camp McDermott well down the beach, about 5 or 6 miles. And then there was a longer way I could go out through what was called Fukai Circle, which is about a block from the Grand Hotel, still is. And Grand Hotels where the morning briefings were held. I was a fixture there in those days, usually most days attending briefings there. So instead of going to Shortway, I just went on down the Fukai Circle. And as I was circling through there, I was overtaken by um, a Jeep or two of Army guys, and they were in heavy flak vests with their helmets, and they veered me off and stopped me and said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, I said, we don't hold this territory." And they sort of gestured over, and and this is the picture I have now, and I can blink my eyes and I can tell you what I saw, which was carnage of a body, and that they just killed this guy. And they said to me, you got to get out of here and go. You're blocked from the Grand Hotel. Run down to the Grand Hotel, get in there, and stay there, and you'll be fine. And so I headed down to the Grand Hotel. But as I got down there, I thought, oh, crap, I don't want to spend my whole day down here at the Grand Hotel. And this looks like where the fighting is. So I just took off on Beach Road and I ran down Beach Road at 50, 60 miles an hour in my Jeep and went down to McDermott. And that's where I stayed. Now it becomes unclear how many days and what the days were. I remember sleeping on the floor of my intelligence office unit down there. But I also remember um, one night, and I don't think Tet went on more, in the fighting in Tet and Trang went on more than 2 or 3 nights. But I remember that things had quieted down enough that another group of officers who lived in a different villa and some guys in my villa, we always decided we were hungry and we were going to go over to the Air Force Club next door and have dinner, and then we were going back to our unit. And so that's what we did. But I do remember, whether it was this time or not, retaking the villa, and that is with one other officer and nobody else. We pulled in on the street, and then we worked our way through the entranceway and down the side of the house, and then we either kicked the door, and probably kicked the door in, and went in and searched the villa. And then nobody had been in it, nobody was in it, uh, and that was one thing I remember. But I also, a different time, remember that, and probably a different night, uh, the guys who'd come to the officers club and we'd eaten, we got back to the villa, main villa, and we were uh, heavily armed and satisfied that we could hold them, that if there were any problems in the street, we were in pretty good shape for that. By the way, we had a guard on our villa every night until Tet, until the day of Tet, in which case he was nowhere to be seen. So somebody tipped him off, and I've never had any problem with that. He left us unguarded the night of Tet, but I always felt his place should have been with his family and his home, and make sure that what happened he didn't get caught up with in our neighborhood and perhaps be killed. So anyway, we get back to the villa and we got plenty of arms, but then 2 or 3 guys who live in a different villa on down on the other side of the downtown area, and on the other side of Fukai Circle, and say, "Oh, we want to go home." So they went home, and that night is when the Viet Cong did sweep through the area. They took to rail yards, which is only a block or so away from us, and the guys at that other villa wound up uh, in a pitched battle. They they survived, but later said, that they were fighting in our backyard. We killed guys in our backyard that night. So now I saw a lot of terrible things, and both then and before and after Vietnam, it's hard not to. If you're in the middle of a war, you're going to see stuff, you're going to smell stuff, you're going to know and sense this. But there is only one image that I remember, and it is this image that I've alluded to, that I was in Fukai Circle and I looked over and there was this man who'd been killed. Uh, and I can blink my eyes and I can see it. The rest of it, I don't see, I don't remember, I cannot pull it up. And that's a very interesting phenomenon. I've talked to others about it. I've talked to Veterans Administration guys about it and so forth. That's a very human reaction. And I've been back to Vietnam 3 times, and I was there probably maybe the last time I was there. We were on the Mekong River with this other officer who'd been in Vietnam, and he told me his story, which was that he'd been down in the Delta and he'd been overrun, and they really had a lot of killing. And he remember finally a guy coming at him with a knife, hand to hand combat, and then click, he doesn't remember anymore. What he does remember is the next day picking up bodies, dumping them into some sort of a burn pit, and cleaning up after that. He doesn't remember any of it. And what I love about this is one of the shrinks that he was talking to at the VA said, "Well, you want to remember because it's there, it's in your memory. It's we can pull this back up." And he said, "No." And that's true with me. I can remember a lot more if I chose to. I'm satisfied about that. And I don't want to go there. And part of that is, well, all of that is the fact that um, I had a very long time without realizing it, decompression after Vietnam. It was when I came back, instead of going to the opportunities I had, which going back to the TV stations and doing that, or going back teaching it at Missouri University, or doing other things. Instead of that, I went out in the woods and bought a little newspaper, and I lived well out in the woods. And I was there for 10 years in that little house, in that little place. And I would wake up, and sometimes there'd be a noise somewhere in the middle of the night, or the dog would bark that I had, and I would be absolutely awake. I mean, stone awake and listening. And then I would have to say to myself, and did, hey, remember where you are. You're back in the United States. You're in the woods. It's quiet. There is no danger here. Oh, that's right. And I'd go back to sleep. And as for fireworks, 4th of July, it was about 25 years before I started saying, it's kind of pretty because I've seen fireworks, and I've seen that stuff and so on. But what I was more profoundly affected by that, and I will tell, if I haven't told the story about how I wound up in the VA medical system, and ultimately in talking to the shrinks there. Um, I didn't recognize how it hadn't gone away, but I got reminded of it over time. Um, so we have notes that we took, so we can kind of talk about this, and I think we've talked about most of it, uh, and sort of the odd things. The the My writing about it is, and about Vietnam, is about 100, maybe 150 pages, single spaced over up until the time I took the final assignment down in Saigon and left the TRANG. And those papers are in the special collections at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. Before I gave them to William and Mary, I I had never looked at them again. I I didn't want to go back there, and I didn't want to dredge up all of that, whatever was there. And I'll say quite honestly, I was fearful of what I might find in what I'd written, and but I could not let them go without knowing what it exactly I was giving. So one night I sat down and I began reading it, and I got into it a ways, and I stopped, and because I didn't think it was heading in a good direction. And I thought about that for a little while longer, and then came back a couple of nights later and I read the rest of it. And there's a lot to be said for facing those things which I suppose I'd say I was afraid of what I would find, um, but I wasn't aware of what it was that I might be afraid of. And so I read that, and I know what's there, and that was fine. But that is also why we went back to Vietnam in 19 in 2009. We were going around the world, my wife and I. This is after I'd sold my newspapers, and we're just going all these places that we'd always wanted to go, and we did this. And we had wound up out in Sydney, and the cruise line said, and they were desperate. They were just desperate. 2009, nobody nobody's on these ships, and so they were kind of giving away. And they said to us, "You look like people who might like to go to Singapore. Would you like to stay on the ship and go to Singapore?" And so we looked at it, and they were stopping in, of all places, the train. And I thought, boy, this is perfect. We'll go to Singapore, and ultimately they took us on around the world and put us on the Queen Mary and took us back to New York out of Southampton. But so I thought, well, we can sail into the Trang in the morning and can have a nice breakfast and get off, go into the Trang, wander around a little bit, have a look around, see how the good old town. And I always loved the Trang, a beautiful, beautiful place. And get back on the ship and we'll sail away, and that'll be that. Well, that was not that. It was I was whatever was buried deeply there inside me set off a near fatal suicidal 4 months where I just got worse and worse and worse until I said to myself, look, you know, it's either them or you. You can't live this way. And but I waited 2 years, and we went back to Vietnam. And we went into, originally that day we had gone into I think Hong Kong, and then we sailed south. And that night, as we were going down the coast of Vietnam, uh, um, I knew where it was, and I said to my wife that morning, um, you may not see me again because I am not going to live um, the way I have lived with whatever happened here at Phu Kai Circle and Mei Lin and in there. I'm not going to. It's either you or me, guys. And as I said, you may not see me again. And I went in that day with the very first. I actually went in with the guys who were setting up the little tents and getting ready for the actual passengers to come in. Who's this guy on the launch with us? And I got off the launch and went looking for somebody, and I found a guy with a motorcycle, and he said his name was Hong Kong. I said, fine, then you can call me Saigon. He said, and he proved to me his name's Hong Kong. And he said, well, where do you want to go? And it's early in the morning, and I said, I want to go. And I told him I want to go here, and so we went there to where Camp McDermott had been, and then because I know the area, and I knew where to go. And then we went down to Mei Lin, where I had been. And I stood in the street and I looked at the villa, which is hardly unchanged. They paved the road; it was dirt in those days. And then we went down the next block down to Phu Kai Circle, and this scared the living crap out of this kid because I stood there and I saw what I had seen that day, and I looked at it, and I looked at the dead body, and I looked at the Marines, and I think they were Marines, and the other guys, and I just stood there, and he crept up to me. Hong Kong crept up to me and looked at me, and then he retreated far away, and and then it was done. And I turned and I walked back up to him. He said, "What did you see?" And I said, "I saw what I hope neither you nor anyone else ever sees." So then this guy, we went down to the market. I want to go down to the market. And so we're in the market, and Hong Kong buys me a drink. And I sort of looked at him. I said, "Look, I'm not going to drink this." So Hong Kong takes a drink. He says it's okay. And I this. And by this, it's only 9:30, 10 o'clock in the morning. And he says, you want a woman? I said, no, I don't. And he said, well, I can, I've got, so not only is he a tour guide, he's a pimp, and I said, well, thank you very much. I appreciate it, but take me back to the ship. And we made a deal. I'd offered him $10 to run me around. We get back to the ship and we're there. And I said, we made a deal here in Hong Kong and I agreed to give you $10. And he said, yeah, that's right. And I said, well, I'm not going to do that. And he kind of got a little concerned. And I said, I'm going to give you $20, which is what I did. And then I walked back down into the area where people were getting off. And Carol Ann was there. And that was the end of it. And so I think this is a story that, at least in my case, I went back and I looked, and it was one of the more difficult things I'd done in my life. But then what had happened at Tet, which I still don't really know, even though I went through it, was finally then in the rearview mirror.